people's attention, so the capacity to attend to something, society looks like this. So there's like, most people like can sort of control their attention. This is where like most people kind of exist, right? So one standard deviation includes 85% of the population, if my statistics is pretty good. But then there are some people over here who have very strong attention. And then some people down here who have attention that wanders a lot. So what we're going to talk about is why human beings have fluctuating or like a wide span of attention, right? So if we look at human beings, if we look at something like, let's say we just look at height as a quality or tendency to get angry. So like we look at anger or height, we see essentially the same thing. So most attributes within human populations are going to follow this kind of bell curve, where like 85% of people are going to be here, and then some people get super angry, and then some people are doormats. And that's just how human beings work. So the question is sort of like why? And it tends to be that, human beings have variability in situations that like variability is beneficial for people. So if we look at something like anger, we don't want everyone to be getting super pissed all the time. We want some people to be like get angry easily, right? And maybe they're going to be our warriors. And then we want some people who are going to be like a little bit more passive, and maybe they're going to be our farmers. And so we tend to see across human populations that we have, a bell curve of cognitive ability, and attention is no different. So then the question becomes like, why wouldn't we want everyone having like a super focused attention? Why do we want people that have attention that wanders? And so the short answer is like, there's a very interesting theory about hunters versus farmers. So some people did some personality research and essentially concluded that there are two types of people. The farmer is someone who like likes routine, doesn't get bored. So like, wants stability. So the farmer will like wake up at 5 a.m. every day, like go out to the fields, do the same thing like day after day after day after day. And they derive a lot of pleasure or enjoyment from like things like routine and stability. They dislike being disrupted. So they don't want like random events to happen. They want to be able to predict things. And they derive a lot of like pleasure, enjoyment, and satisfaction out of routine. And then we have hunters. So hunters are a little bit different. The idea of waking up and doing the same thing over and over and over again is like very, very like annoying or frustrating to them. They get bored easily. So what they need to do is they need to be like more dynamic. So they like, walking through the jungle and paying attention to lots of different stimuli. So they're like, oh, like, look, there's like something happening over here. And then this looks like a animal footprint. And what is that I smell? It seems like something's going on. I smell something strange. And then there's birds circling overhead. Oh, they're like vultures over there. So maybe there's like some kind of predator over there. So hunters are people that integrate a lot of information. And so what we kind of see is that in like old human society, we sort of needed both, right? We needed some people to go out and hunt, and we needed some people to like kind of stay at home and farm. And that the more successful societies were the ones that had like both cognitive types, okay? So in a sense, like what we see is that attention variation within populations is selected for, is a positive. So what does that mean for us, okay? What that means for us is that our society has been shaped over the last year primarily by farmers, right? So like if you kind of look ever since the Industrial Revolution, like we've had, this idea of like fixed time jobs, right? Like as things got more centralized, what we started to see is like, okay, you go to the same place every day, you have your job. Like even the concept of a job, like a thing that you do instead of lots of things that you do, is like a farmer-oriented society, right? Because the farmers basically took over and they're like, everyone's going to have a job. And this is going to be your job, and I'm going to do my job, and we're all going to do our jobs, and then like society will work wonderfully. And then we've got our hunters who are like, I'm bored of my job. I want to do something else. And the farmers were like, no, you have to, if you want to be outside instead of being indoors, you can deliver mail, become a postal worker. And so our society since the Industrial Revolution got heavily shaped by farmers. And so what ended up happening is our society became more and more methodical, more structured, where everyone is the cog in their, in the particular machine that they're a part of. And the farmers love that kind of thing. They're like, fantastic. Like everyone is a cog. There's perfect order. There's stability, and the world is going well. And then there's a group of people who are the hunters who started to struggle in this society. So they actually started to like move into potentially like more dynamic professions, right? So as schooling got implemented, we started selecting for people who can sit in a chair from 8 to 3. So now we started selecting people for their ability to sit in a chair. And then we added college, which is like, okay, who is like farmer enough to not be forced into learning and can kind of learn on their own? So then we added something like a GPA. Right? And what we did is we selected for people in college who are like not dynamic. They're people who can force themselves to go to class, or they don't have to force themselves. They like going to class because they're structured. They go to their 8 a.m. class, they study on time, they do everything on time, they don't procrastinate, and we're going to reward these people. So over time, what happened is society became pro-farmer. And then we did something interesting, okay? What we did is we took the hunter kids in school, and we said, oh my God, these hunter kids they're not able to sit and do what they're supposed to, right? And so then we started diagnosing them with ADHD. So there's a couple of interesting things here. The first is that studies have been done that the student-teacher ratio determines the likelihood of getting diagnosed with ADHD. If you have one teacher to 30 students versus one teacher to 15 students, ADHD will be like twice as likely to be diagnosed in this group than this group. And that's controlling for number of kids. So if I have let's put it this way, like if I have two classrooms, one that has 30 kids and two teachers, and one that has 30 kids and one teacher, Like the number of ADHD diagnoses in this classroom is going to be way higher. And so what we begin to see is something that's interesting about a disorder, which is that a disorder, especially mental illnesses, disorders aren't just disorders by themselves. A disorder evolves when there's a genetic vulnerability plus environmental circumstance. So what we see in ADHD is that if you literally look at the term disorder, there's a lack of order or function within a particular environment. And so for people who have ADHD, what it is their mind is dynamic, right? So that may be the genetic vulnerability. They may be a hunter. And what we're doing is we're putting them in a classroom, right? We're sticking them on a farm. And so this is where the disorder arises within this gap. And this is what ADHD is. Now, this is where we have to go back for a second to our bell curve and acknowledge that, like, for a lot of people that I work with ADHD, it's about finding the right environment for them to thrive in, and then their illness no longer becomes a disorder. It can actually become a disadvantage. I mean, an advantage. But there are certainly people who have very disordered attention to where, like, really it is like feels like a very serious, like, illness to me. But I would say that the majority of people that I work with ADHD, even though it is an illness or a disorder or makes their life hard, that I would say like 2/3 of them, about 70% of them, can function very well with their ADHD in the right circumstance. And in fact, it's even advantageous. So there are some professions that we'll talk about. So event planner is actually surprisingly one. Other examples are like Twitch streamer, esports athlete. So there are actually a lot of professions, even working in the emergency room, or being a paramedic, being a plumber. There's several professions that, bizarrely enough, seem to like work totally fine with people with ADHD. And there's some situations where ADHD and having a dynamic mindset, because remember that the reason you're getting diagnosed is because you're unable to sit in a classroom for like 7 hours a day, right? So like there are even some professions which are actually geared towards ADHD. And if you actually like go back and watch all of the interviews we've done with streamers, what you'll find is that like a greater percentage of streamers compared to the normal population have ADHD, just based on their own self-report, right? Like so many people like will say like, oh yeah, I have ADHD. And it turns out that this kind of hunter mentality can actually be advantageous in some situations. So just to kind of recap, I think the key point here is that there are two kinds of people. There's like farmers and there are hunters. And when you stick a hunter in a farmer society, you'll create an environmental circumstance that allows their dynamic mind to start to become like a disorder or not function well. There's also sort of evidence to this where like when kids get individualized attention, they're able to perform better in school and don't get kind of evaluated or diagnosed for ADHD. So there's a lot of stuff about like, you know, just the amount of structure that people can tolerate. The other thing that tends to go on in a lot of schools is that people will medicate children for the purpose of obedience, right? So like if I'm a teacher and I've got like 30 rowdy kids and I medicate the 5 rowdiest of them, then it's like easy for me to like teach my class, right? And what we tend to see is like the most disruptive kids get diagnosed with ADHD because they can't restrain their attention.